Welcome to week 8, social psychology. Today we're going to be talking about attitudes. So when I ask the question in class, in my face-to-face classes about what is an attitude, students will often say things related to sort of having an attitude or giving someone attitude, this kind of thing. Attitudes are really hard concepts to pin down. Typically in psychology, we talk about attitudes as being an affective response to some person, object, or idea. You can think about this as a global evaluation. So statements like, I like the 49ers, I don't like broccoli, these are attitudes. Attitudes are about things that you like or don't like. You have a positive or negative feeling towards these things. This is in contrast to things like beliefs. Beliefs are pieces of information, right? So I can say I like the 49ers, that's an attitude. I can say the 49ers are 3-2 right now, which is an opinion, or which is a fact or an opinion. I could say the 49ers are going to be the best team in the league this year, which is an opinion. I could say, another team lost and that made me really happy. I like that they lost. That's an attitude. Okay. So the distinction is attitudes are affective feelings towards some object, and beliefs are facts and opinions. All right, so you can think of affect as being an attitude, cognition is being sort of the belief in our ABCs of psychology here, attitudes, behavior, cognition. Attitudes are really useful for us. Life is very complex, and if we had to spend time thinking about all the decisions that we have to make and all of the things that we encounter in our life, we would go crazy. If you imagine sort of the standard cereal aisle, there are hundreds of different kinds of cereals that you can buy. And attitudes make it easy for you to select the cereal that you like, right? I like Cheerios. That's an attitude. I don't have to think about any of these other kinds of cereals because I know that I like Cheerios and that's what I'm going to buy, right? You need those attitudes to make those decisions. Now remember, we talked about this idea that we automatically categorize people, objects, or ideas. We do this automatically. We automatically categorize these into the categories of good and bad, but also into like and dislike. If you are presented with something new, a new object, a new person, a new idea, you are already starting to decide almost automatically whether you like it or dislike it. Again, automatically putting like and things into the like and dislike attitude category. Now, where do attitudes come from? So sometimes attitudes come from just exposure. So we call this the mere exposure effects. We just like things that we see or experience frequently. And I have an asterisk here because there's a qualifier to this. This is sort of what's going on with pop radio. If you ever listen to pop radio, you'll notice a song comes out and then you hear it thousands of times. You hear that same song 3 or 4 times a day, sometimes twice in 1 hour. And the idea here is this mere exposure effect. People who promote pop music know that if you don't really have an attitude one way or the other toward a song, the more often you hear that song, the more likely you are going to be to like that song. Now here's the thing about the mere exposure effect. You will tend to like things more the more you are exposed to them, unless you already dislike the object. So if you dislike Justin Bieber, hearing his new song is not going to make you like the song. In fact, it's actually going to make you dislike it even more. Other ways that attitudes are formed are through classical conditioning. So if you recall classical conditioning from intro psychology, this is repeated pairing of an unconditioned stimulus with an repeated pairing of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus producing an unconditioned response. The idea here is that with attitude formation, what we want to do is we want to pair an existing attitude with a neutral stimulus. Advertisers want you to like their products, so they take an attitude object that is associated with like, and they want you to associate their product with that attitude object. So if people like Tiger Woods, and they see Tiger Woods with Nike, then through this repeated exposure to these pairs, you will like Nike because you like Tiger Woods. Now, this also works in the opposite direction, right? So if Tiger Woods gets into a car accident and he's cheating on his wife, then what happens with Nike? They want to drop their sponsorship, right? This is sometimes why sponsors will leave, because they don't want their brands to be associated with the dislike category in your mind. Other ways, operant conditioning and social learning. So again, just sort of basic learning theory here. Operant condition is being rewarded or punished for endorsing certain attitudes. So for example, if you get an A in statistics class, then you love statistics because you have been rewarded by your hard work by getting an A. Sometimes parents will do this when they're trying to teach their kids. If the child expresses an attitude that is similar to the adult, then we will reward that attitude. So if my daughter says, go 49ers, because she loves the 49ers, then I will reward her for having that attitude with positive attention. Social learning, again, same sort of thing. We can observe other people being rewarded or punished for endorsing certain attitudes. So for example, universities tend to be very liberal, tolerant places. So you can imagine yourself being from a conservative background, showing up at a liberal university and seeing a fellow conservative be sort of punished verbally for expressing conservative attitude. Now, attitudes can vary in strength, so I can sort of moderately like something, like I enjoy, I like rechargeable batteries because I think they're good for the environment, but I don't really have a strong opinion about rechargeable batteries. I will use regular batteries. But strong opinions are difficult to change. Right? If I have a strong political belief, or if I have a strong there is no way you're going to get me to not like Cheerios. I love Cheerios. They're delicious. Right? So think about political attitudes. You are not going to, Glenn Beck was a commentator on Fox News, a particularly vitriolic conservative commentator. There's no way that you're going to convince this guy that President Obama is doing a good job. Right? Strong attitudes are hard to change. In fact, the more often you think about your attitudes, the stronger and more extreme they become. And we talk about this as attitude polarization. So the more we think about it, the more we solidify and strengthen our attitudes. On the other hand, weakly held attitudes are easier to change. So recall the taco example from week 1, right? If I have you write an essay about how much you love tacos, you will come to like tacos more, assuming, of course, that you don't already hate tacos, right? If you have a weak attitude, I can make it a little bit stronger by having you engage in a behavior. Attitudes don't always predict behavior. This is another interesting thing. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. They do predict behavior when there is minimal social pressure, right? So when there is minimal social pressure to against that attitude or that behavior. So for example, you can think about the conservative person at the liberal university. Maybe they are not supportive of some social policy. And so in that case, the social pressure to mention that social policy would be very high, and they'd be reluctant to behave in a way that's consistent with their attitudes. When the attitude is strongly held, they will often predict behavior. So if I strongly believe in Cheerios, then I will probably buy Cheerios at the store. And also when they're specific, right? If you have a specific attitude about a specific object. But people will also behave in ways that go against their attitudes, and we'll talk about this in a couple of ways here in a little bit. All right, so social norms. We talked about these social norms as these standards for acceptable behaviors. And this is also about our beliefs about what others think we should do, what we ought to do, what we ought to say, what we ought to think. Right? And so when social pressure is minimal, our attitudes will predict behavior. All of us, to some degree or another, experience what we call the social desirability bias, which is a tendency to express what we think other people want to hear, to say what we think other people want to hear. It is very wrong to discriminate based on someone's physical appearance. Um, and so if someone asked us, would you go out on a date with this person who might be relatively unattractive, we might not necessarily want to say no just based on their looks alone, because we believe that other people think that it's wrong to discriminate based on physical appearance. We talked about this idea of implicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes don't always correspond with implicit attitudes. So, for example, and we talked about this idea of implicit attitudes when we talked about prejudice. And so, for example, there's a recent study that actually was published within the last couple months that was looking at the implicit attitudes of politicians when it comes to voter ID laws. And what they did was they randomly assigned politicians to receive an email from either John Smith, which is a very white, sort of Anglo-sounding name, or Santiago Rodriguez, which is a very Latino-sounding name. And the email asked the legislators whether or not one needed a driver's license to vote. Now, no one needs a driver's license to vote in any state, so the correct answer is no. And what they looked at was the degree to which the legislators responded to this constituent, to their constituent. And what they found was that legislators who supported voter ID laws or co-sponsored voter ID law bills were significantly less likely to respond to Santiago than they were to John Smith, right? Suggesting that there is some sort of implicit bias that they have against Latinos, or at least supporting that idea. Attitudes predict behavior when it's a strong attitude, right? So these are well-learned attitudes. Also, when it is automated. So, one of the things we talked about was this idea that we can automate, our bodies, our brains are designed to automate for us, to make tasks automatic so we don't have to think about them. If you have the belief that it is important for children to wear seatbelts in the car, then you will probably put a seatbelt on your kid every time you put them in the car, especially if it's a strongly held belief. If you like the Democratic Party better than the Republican Party, then when you go to vote, and this is always funny to talk about in class, but when you go to vote and you're looking at that voter card and there's like 100 judges on there and you've never heard of anyone, if you like the Democratic Party, what are you going to do? You're going to vote Democratic, even though you don't know anything about these people, other than that they're a Democrat or Republican. If you like the Democrats, you're going to vote Democrat. If you like the Republicans, you're going to reliably vote Republican. Okay? Strongly held attitude. Also specific, right? More specific questions lead to higher correspondence, right? So in this study, they asked women about their attitudes towards using birth control. And this is sort of back in the 1970s, a little bit different of a time. And when they said, how do you feel about birth control? Right, this was less predictive of behavior. If women said, well, birth control is probably a good thing to use, that was less predictive of their behavior, whether or not they actually use birth control, versus asking the question, how do you feel about using birth control over the next 2 years? How do you feel that you would use birth control over the next 2 years? And when they asked this more specific question, right, this attitude towards birth control was more predictive of their behavior because it was just more specific. Out of this came this idea of the theory of planned behavior, which is that attitudes plus social norms equals intentions, plus control is equals intentions that leads to behavior. So the example here is, let's say you have an attitude in favor of physical fitness, right? I think that it's good to be physically fit. I think that it's good to be in shape, to exercise. And your friends exercise, the people that you know exercise, you see them jogging and going to the gym, and you think you could probably do this. Like, I could run, I could join a gym, I could, go for a bike ride. So if you have these three things, you've got the positive attitude, the social norms support it, and you have control, you feel like you have some control over this, then this leads to intention. I'm going to start running next week. And then pretty soon you're running in the Chicago Marathon. Well, maybe, maybe not, right? But this sort of leads to this behavior. Attitudes don't always predict behavior, though. So it's another famous study back in 1934. So in the run-up to World War II, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States. People just did not like the Chinese. You can all of the sort of negative stereotypes that you can think about Latinos applied in some way to the Chinese, right? They were just not liked sort of universally in the United States. And so what LaPierre did is he had this Chinese couple go to a bunch of different restaurants and hotels all over the country to see if they would get service. And what they found was they got service in every single hotel and restaurant except for one. There was one where they came in and they were like, nope, sorry, we don't serve Chinese, okay, or the Chinese. But here's what's interesting. Then later on, he sent a survey to these establishments asking them if they would serve a Chinese customer. And 92% of them said that they wouldn't, okay? Which is odd because they all did, right? So this gets at this idea of attitudes not always predicting behavior. They might have the attitude that they don't like the Chinese. And if you ask them, would you serve a Chinese person? They'd be like, oh, of course not. But then when faced with the real possibility of having to deny service to live people in your establishment, many of these people did not actually do that. Right? So attitudes don't always predict behavior. Behavior can influence attitudes, though. We're going to talk about a famous, before we talk about a famous study, we'll talk about this idea of embodied cognition. Physical actions are associated with psychological states. If you've ever told a story to someone, think about a time when you told a story to someone and it's a story about something that happened that made you really angry, right? What you probably notice is that when you're telling that story, your body physically goes back into that state of anger, right? Maybe you tense up, maybe your heart rate goes up a little bit, right? You sort of get tight, you feel that anger again, right? And this is embodied cognition, right? There are physiological aspects of attitudes. There are physiological aspects of the way that we think about things, right? Abstract ideas get tied to these physiological behaviors. So, for example, a famous study, global warming study, they randomly assigned students, participants, to fill out a survey in one of two rooms. One of the rooms was 73 degrees, which is sort of standard room temperature. The other one was a hot room. It was 81 degrees. And then they asked them about their attitudes towards global warming. And what they found was that people in the hot room believed that global warming was a more serious problem compared to the people in the cool room or the room temperature room, right? Suggesting that the physiological state can actually influence your attitudes, right? Physically being hot makes people more concerned about global warming. And this happened even for conservative Republicans, even for people who traditionally have attitudes against global warming. Another interesting thing about attitudes is that we are motivated to be consistent. We have a powerful motivation to have our attitudes be consistent. We don't like flip-floppers. And we want these things to be consistent with other attitudes, our behaviors, and other people. Anytime there's a discrepancy, we're motivated to reduce that discrepancy. So the sort of classic attitude discrepancy is one to do with smoking, right? Most people know that smoking is bad for them. Many people want to stop smoking, and yet they still continue to smoke. Right? And this is what we would call an inconsistency. I have the attitude that I want to stop smoking, that I think I should stop smoking, that smoking is bad for me. And yet, my behavior is inconsistent with this. And yet, I still smoke. I mean, I don't actually smoke, but I, the person who smokes in this example, still smokes, despite having these attitudes. And there's a big issue that sort of arises when we have an attitude that is inconsistent with our behavior. When we have these kinds of discrepancies, we call this cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance is when an attitude or a belief is inconsistent with our behavior, right? This is when we smoke even though we don't want to smoke, even though we don't think smoking is good for us, right? Creates this sense of cognitive dissonance. We are motivated to get rid of this dissonance, right? We want our attitudes to be consistent with each other, and we want our attitudes to be consistent with our behavior. So go through the cognitive dissonance study because it's pretty prevalent, classic. So what they did was they brought participants into a room and they had them do just an awful, awful task. I mean, just the most boring thing imaginable. Imagine yourself, you're a participant in the room and the researcher says, okay, for the next hour, I want you to turn all of these knobs clockwise until they stop. And once you've turned them all clockwise until they stop, go back and start at the beginning and turn them all counterclockwise until they stop. And just keep doing that for an hour. Or there was a peg board. Take all of these pegs and one at a time put them into this pegboard, and then one at a time remove them. Sorry, for a half an hour they were doing this. But again, imagine doing this for a half an hour. Super boring. It's meant to be an awful thing that people don't like to do. But then, once that part of the manipulation was over, the researcher asked them to lie to another person. They said, okay, the study's over, but we've got some people out here in the waiting room, and we know that this task is not the most fun task, but would you just go out there and tell them that you enjoyed it, that you really liked doing this task? Right? Now, obviously, this is an inconsistent attitude, right? Most of them didn't like doing the task, but they're going to do a behavior where they're going to say that they liked it. They're going to lie, right? And here's the thing. They said, because you're going to do this for us, we're going to pay you. Either $1, some of them got $1, or some of them got $20. And then afterwards, they were asked about how much fun they had doing the task. And what happened was, the participants who were paid just $1 actually had a more positive attitude towards this boring task than the participants who were paid $20. So essentially what happened was, going out into that room, right? So you have this inconsistent behavior attitude combination. The task is super boring, but I just went and lied to this person and told them how fun it was. Now, for the people who got paid $20, they didn't change their attitude. But the interesting thing was the people who got paid $1 actually did change their attitude. And the reason for this is that the people who were paid $20 had a good justification for lying. When you ask them, why did you lie to that person and tell them that it was a fun task? Well, I lied because I got paid $20. And, I'll do a lot for $20, especially back in the 1970s, or 1960s, $20 is a lot of money, right? And so this allows that inconsistency to be explained away. Well, the task was super boring, and then I lied and said that it was fun, but the reason why I lied was because of the $20, and so, I'm fine with that. But on the other hand, the people who got paid $1, they didn't really have a justification, right? The task was super boring, and I just told this person it was super fun. I got $1. I guess it wasn't that bad, right? The way that they were able to deal with this dissonance was to change their attitude, right? They essentially changed their attitude as a way of dealing with the fact that they had just done something inconsistent. They had told a person that a really boring task was fun. Now, this is kind of crazy, right? Because you would think that the more you get paid, the more you're going to like something. Well, we all know that that's not true. You can certainly, hate your job and get paid very well to do it. So money can get you to do something, but not necessarily like it. Now, we are motivated to get rid of dissonance, right? And there's a couple different ways that we can get rid of this dissonance. And again, dissonance is just when there is this inconsistency between our thoughts and our behaviors, between our attitudes and our behaviors, or our attitudes and beliefs and these kinds of things, right? First, we can explain it away, right? Well, I know that smoking is bad for me and I want to quit smoking, but I'm still smoking and I'm going to quit at the new year. I'm going to quit on 2015 or November or January 1st. Right, so we can explain it. Or you can change your attitude. You can say, you know what? Smoking isn't that bad for you. Like, I'm just going to go ahead and keep smoking. Right? You can change your attitude. Or you can change your behavior. The problem here is in that $1 condition, they had no alternative explanation for their behavior. They couldn't explain it away. Why did you do that? Right? Well, I must have done it because the task wasn't that bad. Right? We call this insufficient justification. When there's not enough justification, we change our attitude to reduce this dissonance. You can also do this with insufficient deterrence, another famous study. So the kids in this study, they were allowed to play with as many toys in a room as they wanted to, except one particular toy. You can kind of think about this like the Garden of Eden, if you're familiar with Christian mythology or theology. So the kids are told you can play with whatever you want except for this one toy. And the way that they were told is either one of two ways. They were either given a really strong warning, like do not play with this toy or else it will be the end of your little world. Not so strong as that, but you get my understanding. Strong warning or a weak warning. Just, do me a favor. This toy, just please don't play with it. Right? So strong warning, weak warning. And then what they did, right? Obviously, while the adults are in the room, none of the kids play with the toy. But then they were given the opportunity to play with the toys again without the experimenter watching. And what happened was the kids who got the weak warning were actually less likely to play with the toy than the kids who got the strong warning. Right? And then the reason why this is cognitive dissonance is when the little kids are sort of thinking to themselves, why am I not playing with that toy? Right? The answer that they're coming up with was like, well, it's probably not. Why didn't I play with that toy? Well, it's probably just not fun. But the kids who got the strong warning, when they said, why didn't I play with that toy? Well, I didn't because I was going to get in trouble. But now that no one's watching, right, I want to play with that toy. Right? So this is insufficient deterrence. So another sort of social psychology tip for parenting, right? You don't want to threaten too much. Right? Because if you threaten your kids, then the only reason that they're doing what they're doing is to avoid being punished or to avoid sort of getting in trouble. And then they will do whatever they want to do when no one is looking. Now, things that are necessary for cognitive dissonance to happen, you have to feel like your actions are freely chosen. There cannot be alternative explanations for why you did what you did. And these can't be undoable actions. You can't be able to take it back. And you must feel that there are real consequences for your actions, right? We don't experience cognitive dissonance over little things. We experience cognitive dissonance over big things, lying to people, those kinds of things. So the ways that we deal with cognitive dissonance, right? We can change our attitude, or we can try and perceive like it was out of our control, right? By removing control, that can reduce dissonance. Trying to come up with alternative explanations, or downplaying these discrepancies, right? It's not really a big deal. Like, yeah, I know smoking's bad for me, but I'll quit eventually. It's not a big deal. Or another fun one is reminding ourselves of our good qualities, right? If we experience cognitive dissonance because of something that we did, thinking about other positive aspects of ourselves can actually reduce that dissonance. If we remind ourselves about our values and our good qualities, this will reduce dissonance even when it has nothing to do with behavior. And self-affirmations are actually really powerful ways to influence attitudes and behavior. So that's it for this week's web lecture. Make sure you check out the discussion post and the quiz for this week.